Hi, I am Jack Brewer, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Expanding Frontiers Research Interactive Research Project. It's a participant-based recreational research project that promotes best practices. It's done through exploring alternating topics of public interest in an entertaining and educational environment. Our first topic is Danny Casolaro, a writer found dead in a hotel room in 1991, and the octopus murders he was investigating. They're a far-reaching, complex series of conspiracies that intertwine fact and unsubstantiated allegations as depicted in a popular Netflix documentary. Our goal in this project, and indeed this episode, is twofold. We want to learn about a topic by accurately identifying properly sourced information, promoting the process thereof. The octopus murders are a virtual template for a knot of stories of varying degrees of reliability, all tied together, and therefore they provide a framework for sharpening our research skills. You can find more EFR blog posts, articles, interviews, and videos at expandingfrontiersresearch.org, at the EFR Patreon, and by following us on Blue Sky. You'll find all those links in the video show description. If so inclined to join our valued financial supporters, you can do that with a paid Patreon account or at our GoFundMe page. You'll find that link in the video description as well. I'm joined tonight by a variety of knowledgeable researchers and skilled researchers, including Erica Lutz, the Executive Director of Expanding Frontiers. Thanks for being here, Erica.
Thanks, Jack, for putting forward such a great group of people, and I'm really excited for this conversation tonight. And thanks, Alison, for helping with this.
We're also joined by Adam Gorightly, who is contributing to the collective body of research with some information about some of the people we'll be talking about tonight, and has a forthcoming book, Agent of Disruption, The Many Lives of Fred Lee Chrisman. Thanks for being with us, Adam.
Hey, great to be here. This ought to be fun.
Yeah, it should be fun and interesting. We also have researcher Stephen Long. We have Rachel and Jeff from over at UFO Sunset. We have Sharon Brown, who is a political researcher and avid reader. Thanks to all of you for being here. And to get us started, Alison Godfrey Brandel is going to lead this group discussion tonight. She's a political researcher and a researcher of conspiracies. She's a paralegal and the recipient of a Glenn Kirshner 2026 Justice Warrior Award for her related activism and volunteerism. Thanks for being here and leading us tonight, Alison.
Thanks, Jax. Thanks, everybody. I'm happy to be here, and I've enjoyed a lot of the rabbit holes.
Sure. Well, take it away.
Okay. I am not a conspiracy theorist, but I am conspiracy curious. My background and training as a paralegal with expertise in legal writing and research and critical thinking gives the meme, do your own research, a different meaning. That is why I appreciate the work of Expanding Frontiers Research. They focus on research done the right way. The past 10 years filled with propaganda and disinformation has allowed me to hone my skills of discernment. A huge shout out to Jim Stewartson and his Mind War Substack. Following him since his emergence in 2020 has given me much insight into psychological warfare and allowed me to devise a way to look at fringe topics and still protect my brain, because fringe topics are used often to suck you in, indoctrinate you, and hijack your brain. I first heard about the Octopus murders in 2018. It is such a quagmire filled with rabbit hole upon rabbit hole, I didn't know if it was believable. Then Sarah Kendzior published her book, They Knew, and there was a whole chapter devoted to the Octopus murders. That indicated to me that there was something to the Octopus murders, and it intrigued me more. I was thrilled when Netflix came out with the documentary we'll be discussing tonight, entitled American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders. I've watched it more than once. Then a few months ago, our book club started reading Craig Unger's book, Den of Spies, about the October surprise, which coincidentally ties in a bit with the Octopus murders. I include Jack and our book club leader Sharon in on the Netflix documentary, and they watched it and were intrigued as well. I do want to say that further researching this topic is challenging. I ordered 2 books about it. One book is written by one of the journalists who is featured in the documentary. It's well-sourced and researched. The other one puts information together, but I was hesitant to rely on the accuracy of the information presented if it wasn't found elsewhere. I also tried to find podcasts about it. There are many in the right-wing sphere, and to that I say, protect your brain from hijacking and disinformation. So it's really a challenge to find credible information on this topic. That's why Jack FOIA'd the FBI after we became interested in the Octopus murders. And Jack, if you want to discuss how you FOIA'd them and where we're at with the results.
Sure. My general thinking in any topic is to start with some FOIA requests and find what can be documented from different agencies. And I've gotten to where I'm not really interested in hearsay or what can be inferred or what people kind of get from piecing things together as much as some type of records that we can look at and read. And so I started with a request to the FBI on Danny Casolaro, who died in 1991 under what some feel are suspicious circumstances, and discovered that through records obtained from the FBI, I initially just asked for what's been previously released. They provided me several pages, and then I submitted another request and asked them to do an additional search for what may not have been included in that response, and they have not given a final response on that yet. But in these first records, and you can find the link to them in the video show description, so you can look at them yourself. That's something Sarah Scholes frequently says in discussions with EFR, is get the records yourself that other people reference, that other people talk about, get them yourself and look at them. And one of the things that I discovered initially in these records was that Danny Casolaro was known to the FBI as early as the late 1980s, because we can see an exchange between the Alexandria, Virginia field office and another field office where Alexandria is being alerted that it's heavily redacted, so you just kind of have to piece it together. But Alexandria is being told that someone told the FBI that Casolaro may know someone, and this someone that's redacted is apparently associated with the Watergate conspiracy and the bugging of the Democrat National Headquarters, as there is a document about that given to the Alexandria field office, and they're supposed to go talk to Casolaro and interview him. So a resulting document of this chain of events is that Alexandria does a background check on Mr. Casolaro, and like just immediately I noticed he apparently did have a drinking problem. We can see that his criminal record shows that he had multiple DWIs, and there at the bottom of the page you can see where he was contacted in 1987 at his place of business about the issue at hand. And he stated he's an independent writer. He told them that he does a newsletter about computers, that it's no big deal. He qualified that it does not contain any classified information, which would suggest that was at issue for him to say that. And then whoever this was they were asking him about, he seems to have advised the FBI he did not know the person. And they're gonna just document that and keep it at that until they have reason to think otherwise. But I thought that's kind of interesting that his drinking was implied heavily in the documentary, but it doesn't necessarily make any conclusions one way or the other about his assumptions and theories. And we should also point out that the significance of the various conspiracies do not rest on Danny Casolaro's judgment or even whether he was murdered or not. Like you can take any answer to that you want, and you still have to figure out what happened with INSLAW, what happened with the casino in California, what happened with all these other things, because they're not the same issue. So that's something to consider as we continue. Now, a lot of these FBI records consisted of interested parties writing their elected officials or the FBI, encouraging them to look into the Casolaro death. And one of these letters that stood out to me, it's undated, but you can tell by the White Collar Crime Division having it in 92, it appears that it would have obviously been before that. It seems to have been from San Francisco, so that might give us some clues as well. They redacted the sender, and it was to, of all people, the Secretary of State. And they were alerting the Secretary of State that now there's been yet another murder. Alan D. Standorf, who further research reveals was an NSA man, and he was found dead in his car at the airport, and he was reportedly a contact of Casolaro. And one of the things that stood out to me as well at the bottom of page 1 there, you can see that this individual that wrote this letter felt qualified to explain who they thought Casolaro was going to West Virginia to meet and what the meeting was about. And then there's quite a bit of redacted information. I appealed these redactions, and that appeal is still pending. And my appeals basically argue that if records show that there's not a government conspiracy, or that there's not wrongdoing or criminal activity to investigate, that's as important to the public good as there being a crime to investigate. And so that's kind of the argument of my appeal, is that either way, this becomes information of significance to the public. And then there's yet another death that's documented in the FBI files. A British journalist was killed in Chile, curiously enough, in a hotel room as well. He was also an apparent suicide, but conspiracies came up because he was involved in investigating some of the same people that Danny was. And yet another document in these FBI records obtained shows that in 1992, when acting on the urging of different Congress members to look into this, and there was an investigation done on INSLAW, they talked to a columnist with the Washington Post that wrote an article called "Suspicious Death Hangs Over INSLAW Case." And further research revealed that that was an article written by Jack Anderson and Michael Benstein. And the piece describes a House Judiciary Committee report. And in that report, the writers say it suggested that FBI agent Thomas Gates was in contact with Casolaro in the weeks leading up to his death, and that for various reasons, Agent Gates had doubts about the suicide and the circumstances as well. And so the FBI wanted to speak to the author or authors of that article and ask them what their sources were. And they were informed, according to this document, that the source was just the House Judiciary Subcommittee investigation report, that there weren't more sources than that. I interpret from this that it's not just a matter of being concerned about information leaking, but that the FBI was attempting to follow up. Like, okay, who? Tell us. I don't know to what extent they interacted with their own agent, or to what extent that may have been true or not. It's hard to say. But there is evidence in the FBI file that they tried to follow up on some leads and did not find that to bear fruit. And last but not least, the records contain a couple of pages that appear to be composed by Danny about the octopus and the cast of characters. There are several pages that are typed like this that are called The Octopus by Danny Casolaro, that seem to have been taken from his notes that may have been found. And I could highlight all of them for one reason or another, but just for this discussion, we can see the Riconosciutos are in there. and that even Danny acknowledged Michael Riconosciuto as a self-proclaimed scientist without a portfolio. And also, Danny Sheehan is listed on this cast of characters who people with interest in the UFO community will know him as a dubious attorney who supports dubious UFO disclosure characters. And at this point in time, he was associated with the Christic Institute, who researchers have identified as an influence on Casolaro and his thinking, his lines of conspiracies. We've also submitted some requests on some of the other characters, such as Marshall Riconosciuto, Michael's father. And interestingly enough, FBI already responded that it has no records responsive to release on Marshall Riconosciuto. And we have some others like Robert Booth Nichols that I'm sure we'll be talking about later, who I find to be one of the more interesting characters that FBI has not issued a final response on that yet. But thank you, Alison. That's where we're at so far with FOIA.
Okay. So what are the octopus murders? We've kind of alluded to it, but they center around Danny Casolaro's suspicious death. He was found dead in a hotel room in West Virginia. After he was pursuing a story and writing a book entitled The Octopus, and it's about the connection between shadowy, hidden, and not so hidden government figures, the international intelligence community, organized crime, and scandals such as the Iran-Contra affair, the October surprise, otherwise known as the Iran hostage crisis, and the INSLAW promise software dispute. Craig Unger describes the octopus as the Bermuda Triangle of spooks, guns, drugs, and organized crime. Casolaro himself defined the octopus as a vast transnational network of corruption stretching from the DOJ to the CIA, to the FBI, to numerous private law and technology firms around the world. And Casolaro was started off being interested in the promise compromise software produced by the American technology firm INSLAW and was sold to the US government by, among others, Robert Maxwell. The software was said to enable espionage once installed, allowing easy access to US government secrets. After Robert Maxwell died mysteriously in November of 1991, software successors to Promise were handled by his twin daughters, Christine and Isabel Maxwell, whose Chiliad database technology is now used by the FBI. The sisters of Ghislaine Maxwell remained involved in the software trade for decades. So this highlights a connection from Sarah Kinzior's book to Robert Maxwell. The documentary doesn't discuss it, but I wanted to bring it up because it's, again, it seems like so many things are connected to this. And I think it's interesting that they didn't add in the connection, but maybe it's because Casolaro didn't mention him much in his research, because technically he was working for Mossad. So, and then it's called the Octopus Murders just because there are other murders, I mean, that Danny was investigating that are tied to the octopus. And then obviously his became a topic of the octopus murders, his own death, I should say. To understand what Casolaro was researching, we must go back to the INSLAW promise software dispute. Bill Hamilton's company, INSLAW, was under contract with the DOJ to develop a new case management software called Promise, which stands for Prosecutors Management Information System. It would allow prosecutors to connect cases and criminals. This was the first of its kind software and would change the way criminal cases were managed around the country, basically from going from paper files to actually being able to, for jurisdictions to connect to one another. The DOJ tried to back out of the contract and refused to pay INSLAW $10 million to install Promise. According to Hamilton, the DOJ not only stole the software, but added a so-called backdoor that allowed spying. DOJ's refusal to pay put INSLAW into financial jeopardy, eventually leading to a bankruptcy filing. The bankruptcy judge, George F. Basin, ruled in favor of INSLAW and against the DOJ. As a result, the judge was fired 3 months after the ruling. If that isn't a huge red flag, I don't know what is. Eventually, the government appealed the decision and the court ruled in favor of the DOJ. So INSLAW was left high and dry. And my question that I have is, why was the US government so hell-bent on not paying INSLAW? And that makes it more suspicious in my mind. And why did they have to get rid of the bankruptcy court judge? That's just like, to remove a judge is a big deal. Anyone have any thoughts?
Thoughts on INSLAW? The judge, anybody?
I mean, just like I pointed out before the show, I think there's still some doubt as to whether or not they actually owed the INSLAW any money, because INSLAW was started as a nonprofit institute, like the Institute for Social and Legal Research. I forget the actual title of it. And they were given government grants to develop the software as public domain software. And what my understanding what happened is the grants run out, they cut them off, and INSLAW was so over budget on other software and bad management that they were going bankrupt and ran out of money, and they felt suing the government to try and get more money out of them was the way to go. But I'm not sure you can actually say the government owed them any money in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And we don't really have any clear indications that the reason the judge was removed had anything to do with INSLAW, right? That's just kind of an inference that's been made.
Yes.
Okay.
I have more info on that. I haven't been able to look into that more, but the documentary definitely infers that that's what happened.
And, you know, to the point that Jeff's making, if it was the case that they weren't owed any money and whatnot, and there was no theft, and he made a ruling like that, which was later overturned, you could see how there could possibly be, you know, grounds for that, I guess, right? If he's making bad rulings.
That I didn't mention is that the person that was appointed as the judge was a former INSLAW attorney that worked for the government on the INSLAW case. And so there seems to be some conflict of interest with that. So that seems a little suspicious.
Yeah, it did seem like it's so easy to infer a conspiracy there that if there wasn't one, they would have gone out of their way to avoid like that
Right.
judge hearing that case and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Wasn't the argument also that it was that it was tried in the wrong court in the first place, that it should have never been in front of that bankruptcy judge, or was that a different case? Because the Netflix documentary mentioned that they said the case went in front of the wrong court.
I don't know.
I don't recall.
That's
again, that's one thing to look into, I guess.
Now seems as good a time as any as well to mention that where I think the value of sifting through these circumstances that like y'all are getting at here, to really understand them, you have to take it down to the minutia. And I agree with that. And it's like this bird's nest of complicated stuff that has to each line be pulled out and taken down to minutia that clearly has unreliable narrators that are all over the board with some of their statements too. So it makes it interesting to follow, like from a sociological point of view, as well as a good research practice project. And also it just kind of serves as a template of how to do disinformation and misinformation and confuse reporters, confuse FBI agents, confuse law enforcement for reasons that really just can't even be discerned, or you're not really even sure who was doing the confusing in some circumstances.
Yeah, I would point out, like some other people were pointing out before the show, that we don't necessarily have a reason to trust Bill Hamilton. I mean, he worked for the NSA. He could be he could have been collaborating with Michael Riconosciuto or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean they kind of threw that on us after they already, in the documentary, I'm already kind of feeling sympathetic for INSLAW and like they're the good guys and something horrible happened here. And then I realized that the guy that's representing them is apparently former NSA and or intelligence community, and starts, because the more you look into him, the more unreliable he gets as well. That like on both sides of the aisle, there's unreliable narrators in the story. Yeah.
So Jeff brought up that, or I think someone typed in the chat that the court did rule that it was the wrong jurisdiction, the original bankruptcy case, and so that's why it was moved. So thanks, Jeff. Or I think whoever put that in there, I think it was Jeff. So I thought the best way to discuss the rest of this was to kind of break it down by the different players, because each one is there's so much with each one. So first, I wanted to discuss Bill Hamilton, who we talked about. He's the president and co-founder of INSLAW, and he interestingly previously worked for the NSA. He introduced Casolaro to some key sources, including Michael Riconosciuto, and he definitely had an interest in publicizing his fight with the DOJ over the Promise software. I found it interesting in the appendix that Adam Gorightly provided us that the person who introduced Bill Hamilton and Michael Riconosciuto was Jeffrey Steinberg of the Executive Intelligence Review, a newsletter published by the conspiracy-prone cult leader and sometimes presidential candidate Lyndon LaRoche. So I find it, because Michael Riconosciuto, we'll talk about him next, is such a confounding character in all of this. I found it was interesting how Bill Hamilton got introduced to him, and I know after I finished the documentary, I questioned everything about Bill Hamilton and his role in this, his motives, and unreliable sources. Like at the very end, when they tracked down a woman who was a source of his, and she supposedly, like, she had like this official look seemingly title from Bill Hamilton, but then I don't even remember what she did for some administrative something for the government. And she says where she got the information was a note at a bowling alley. So it really makes you just think about, like, wait, this NSA guy who is supposed to know how to deal with this stuff is relying on this unreliable source.
Yeah, again, I'm gonna, Adam, if you want to talk about that some, Riconosciuto and, you know, how he met Casolaro and all, because it reminded me of in Adam's book, Saucer, Spooks, and Kooks, he talks about a feedback loop that, you know, the spooks give people information to take to other people who give it back to the spooks, and they make books out of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's how it's worked with Riconosciuto for several decades. But yeah, we mentioned that Jeffrey Steinberg guy with the Executive Intelligence Review. Supposedly, I guess he was the editor there, and it was a Lyndon LaRouche publication. And this was even before, I believe, Casolaro came in to the picture, that the Executive Intelligence Review was covering the Promise INSLAW story. And of course, you know, LaRouche, that's a pretty heavy conspiracy-oriented publication. I mean, LaRouche himself was had all kinds of paranoid conspiracies swirling around him, was kind of the anti-New World Order perspective, the deep state. And so, you know, this was a story that was getting, you know, talked about through the publication like Executive Intelligence Review, that this was some dark, vast conspiracy against Bill Hamilton and INSLAW with this Promise software. And so, as I understand the connective tissue here, it was Michael Riconosciuto had some interaction with the LaRouchians and this Jeffrey Steinberg. And this was at the time when, well, probably should give some background on Michael Riconosciuto before we take that any farther.
Do you want to do that? I have something I kind of prepared, but if you want to talk about him.
Well, go ahead and share what
Okay.
you have, and I can add on to that.
Yes, that would be great.
Sounds great.
Okay, Michael Riconosciuto is probably the single most important witness and one of the most problematic witnesses in the entire Cabazon INSLAW story. Casolaro described Riconosciuto as a scientist, spy, computer hacker, and a criminal. He wondered who he really was and how he knows so much about Promise. Casolaro went on to say that Michael Riconosciuto's mind is as willful and fragmented as the script he lives and the land he travels. There was an article written about Michael when he was 10 years old, after he strung up an alternative telephone service in his neighborhood. At 16, he had worked with a Nobel laureate at a Stanford physics lab who remembered him well, and it sounds like Casolaro actually talked to, I didn't catch the Nobel laureate's name, but it sounds like Casolaro actually talked to him. By the age of 24, Riconosciuto was arrested for manufacturing LSD and PCP in an underwater lab created to avoid detection. His knowledge of chemistry, laser physics, and computer software made him an object obsession in intelligence. Everyone told Casolaro, including, we need to talk about him too, Michael Riconosciuto's dad, Marshall Riconosciuto. Everyone told Casolaro to control Michael. In a sworn affidavit, Michael Riconosciuto claimed that he was the one who altered the Promise software with a secret surveillance backdoor for international intelligence use, including during work linked to the Cabazon reservation, which we will discuss a little bit in a little bit more. He later had claimed that he worked on weapons technology, explosives, and other intelligence projects. It has been substantiated that he worked as director of research for Cabazon Wackenhut corporate operation, which we'll discuss in a little bit. The House Judiciary Committee obtained documentation and testimony establishing substantial parts of that relationship. And 3 days after Riconosciuto submitted that affidavit in 1991 concerning promise, he was arrested in Washington state on drug charges. The Washington Post reported his arrest on March 30th, 1991, describing him as a potential witness for INSLAW. Riconosciuto subsequently argued that his prosecution was part of an effort to silence him. Riconosciuto's story contains a mixture of things that are demonstrably true and things that remain extraordinary allegations. And this is where I would invite you, Adam, to talk about what you have written about and what you know about Michael and about Marshall Riconosciuto, his dad, who Marshall Riconosciuto was connected to CIA. He was an intelligence community lobbyist, amongst other interesting things. So
Yeah, I don't know about that one. As far as being a working directly with the CIA, that's once again you get into
that was in the documentary. So,
right.
But yes.
I haven't seen any evidence for that, nor I think they might have said it in the documentary that it was substantiated that he worked as the research director for Cabazon, Whack and Hot, the joint venture they had. And I don't necessarily haven't seen proof of that as well. There definitely were some connections. All of these people knew each other, but what we do know, it is true. Yeah, he was this childhood prodigy genius type of guy. He won science fairs, developed an argon laser. This is in his early teens. Was doing work with sonar. And there, one of those newspaper articles from the time said, this was like 1960s, so he was in his early teens, had developed this underwater laboratory where he was working with sonar. So he had a lot of stuff going on. You mentioned he had got a bunch of telephone wire and strung it around his neighborhood and basically set up their own telephone, illegal underground telephone system with him and a bunch of his buddies that they were using until the local telephone company busted them. And so in 1968, he came under surveillance by the DEA, and I think it was like a joint task force. This was revealed in 1972 when he was arrested, that they had been surveilling him for 4 years. So that was like from 1968 to 1972. And through his research as a lad, that led to this underground or this underwater drug laboratory along the Duwamish River, where they basically accessed it by getting in scuba gear and bringing all their equipment. So basically set up a drug lab, and the cops were actually surveilling, watching all of this going on, and they were like depositing some of their drug drop-offs were in containers along the Duwamish River. And they also had Michael was basically the person leading this criminal conspiracy with at least a half a dozen others. He had other drug labs set up. So arrested in 1972, and it was manufacturing, distributing huge quantities of LSD, PCP. During the trial, the people that were part of this criminal conspiracy flipped on him. A couple just fled and weren't able to testify, but one of the folks testified that Michael had indeed led this criminal conspiracy. When Michael testified, he claimed that he had basically a drug mob. He had kind of turned him into like Jesse Pinkman on Breaking Bad, and were against his will, forcing him to, manufacture all these drugs and distribute them. I guess the judge and jury didn't buy it, and he was sent up, for several years in prison through most of the 1970s. During that trial, his father testified on his behalf, Marshal Riconosciuto. And Marshall, it's kind of interesting to see, Marshall said that he had obtained a loan, he didn't say from whom, of $80,000 that he had given to Michael for scientific development. There was no evidence that anything besides drugs were ever developed, but Marshall claimed that a lot of this underground laboratory was to find out ways to like remove pollutants from the Duarmish River and these type of things. But you look at it was $80,000 in 1972. So if you stuck that in Google, it'd probably be $500,000 now. A pretty sizable amount of money. Marshall Riconosciuto always played dumb about this drug operation, but I would guess that the money behind him was the guy Patrick Moriarty, who was talked about also in the Octopus murders, who was the founder of Red Devil Fireworks and worked with Marshall Riconosciuto for many years. Marshall was kind of his bagman, and ultimately Patrick Moriarty got busted in one of the biggest scandals in California history for buying off politicians. Anyway, one key thing to point out here was that it was a huge criminal conspiracy. Michael Riconosciuto claimed that was actually behind his drug bust, and he was set up by a bunch of mobsters and West Coast mobsters, that he was totally innocent of producing any drugs. Once again, the jury found him guilty, and he spent most of the 70s in prison. So, boy, we can get it deep into the weeds here, but when he got out, he was basically kind of working for his father, engineer in California, at different sites that were toxic waste sites that Riconosciuto and a group, including Patrick Moriarty, were trying to sell in real estate deals. A lot of shadiness went on with all of this, and that was one of the reasons that Patrick Moriarty got indicted in the mid 80s. But and it looked like, quite possibly, if you look into a lot of this, it appears that Michael was continuing different drug operations. They were just using it under the cover of different businesses that Riconosciuto and Patrick Moriarty had set up. One was like a kitty litter operation in Maricopa, California. Anyway, we kind of jump forward to the late 80s, 90s. Riconosciuto is busted again, now in Washington state, for dealing and manufacturing huge quantities of amphetamines and methadone. And he claimed at that time and during his trial, once again, that it was this vast conspiracy that had set him up. Instead of West Coast mobsters, he added on to that it was this network of satanic pedophiles that had infiltrated various governments, all aspects of politics, including.
He was ahead of his time.
Well, he was in on the Satanic Panic. Really, he was one of the first people kind of pushing that. A close associate of him during that period was Ted Gunderson, who became famous in conspiratorial lore as, you know, one of the people pushing the Satanic Panic with the McMartin preschool things. There are these characters you talked before about the Christic Institute that were also associated with that group, like Bo Greitz was part of this. You could call it Riconosciuto conspiracy network. What's his name? Robert Booth Nichols seemed to be connected to this bunch, and here's where the octopus tentacles are. They start reaching out to people in ufology. So once again, that was, you know, what Riconosciuto, when he got busted, he was blaming it on this vast conspiracy. And that's around the time he was talking to these people, the Laurentians, and got in contact with the Bill Hamilton, the INSLAW founder, and Riconosciuto started pushing forth this claim that he had back engineered or created this back door into the Promise software during that period. And at this time, he started talking to these congressional committees. And what I believe he was doing, he was trying to work out an immunity deal by coming up with these stories, by having something to trade, you know, with the story about how he was involved with the Promise software. I don't buy his involvement with the Promise software. Riconosciuto is very good at taking in different information and names and weaving stories to his own benefit. And if you look at all the stories he's, you know, he's created or had a hand in promoting over the years, the, you know, this, his involvement with the Promise software just seems like another one of those tall tales to me, which doesn't mean that, you know, he knew a lot of people. He knew people involved in that Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture. He was involved in this with Robert Booth Nichols. They were trying to get a thing going called Meridian Arms, and they were trying to work out these different deals. But I don't, you know, once again, from what I can tell, he was never the research director for this Cabazon Wackenhut joint venture. And I think, you know, that, yeah, that's basically my view on Michael Riconosciuto and his involvement with this. And he's the one, it seems to me, that started throwing a lot of these names at Danny Casolaro with it. You know, it's like a who's who of names involved in conspiracy culture. From, okay, let's throw in a little E. Howard Hunt and whoever the director of the CIA was at that time, and also throw in actual people they knew, you know, like Robert Booth Nichols and the other Nichols that was the basically administrator for Cabazon at the time.
Yeah, and then Hamilton introduced, I guess, Casolaro to him. That is almost a Paul Benowitz move at that point. Let me ask you about this for people that don't know. You came at this partially because Fred Chrisman, unreliable narrator of UFO World, was a contact of Marshal Riconosciuto, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the great story. And so to lend credence to conspiracy theories, there needs to be nuggets of truth in there, little kernels of fact. And one of them is that, yeah, that's been one of the things that Michael Riconosciuto knew Fred Krisman growing up. And even Riconosciuto says that Krisman was his mentor, and that Krisman was friends with Marshal Riconosciuto. And all of this is true, actually. And, Krisman was one of the great serial fabulists, and I consider Michael Riconosciuto to have followed in his footsteps. So there's a book called The Murder of the City, Tacoma, which is Fred Krisman's memoir. And to me, the book is Krisman in the 68, 69 period had gotten himself involved in a lot of craziness in Tacoma City politics, and there's a lot of negative stories coming out about him. He'd had confrontations with the police, and this is the same time the Garrison investigation started. There was a series of stories about Krisman that didn't project him in the best of light. And so I think his motivation writing the book Murder of the City, Tacoma, was to spin alternative facts about what he claimed had been really going on in Tacoma City politics. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds with that, but Michael Riconosciuto appears once in that book. And it's during this period where Krisman claimed that there was two factions in Tacoma City politics. It was ran under the city manager system, and Krisman and his buddies, including Marshal Riconosciuto, were anti-city manager. The city management faction was the more progressive. They were pushing things like urban renewal and civil rights, during this whole Great Society period. So there was this whole conflict that went on between Krisman, who is kind of a behind-the-scenes player, bagman type, and other factions of Tacoma City politics. And Krisman was claiming that the Tacoma News Tribune newspaper was working with the city manager, and they had the police working with them all, and that they were basically going after Krisman and his bunch. Krisman claimed there was assassination attempts, and that each side were bugging each other with wiretaps. And that's where Michael Riconosciuto comes into the story. He claims he found some bugs at Marshal Riconosciuto's office. It's around 68 or so, which is kind of interesting. So that's where he comes into the story. If you look at that in hindsight, what do we know about Michael Riconosciuto during that period? That he was under surveillance by the authorities. And I believe it's possible that Marshal Riconosciuto and Fred Krisman, who's also really tight with these guys, also got caught up in this surveillance. And so, yeah, he was good friends. I talked to Fred Krisman Jr., his son, and Marshal Riconosciuto would, he'd show up at the Krisman house all the time. He'd walk through the front door without knocking. They were such good friends. And I asked him if he ever met Michael Riconosciuto, and he said, well, yeah, there was a couple of occasions I met him. And this was Fred Krisman Jr. was probably 15 or 16 at this time. Met Michael Riconosciuto on one occasion. He came by his father's house, and his dad was going to give him a lift somewhere. Fred Jr. went with him. Fred Jr. was in the back seat, and Michael Riconosciuto had this huge German Shepherd that he brought along, who he claimed was his service dog from Vietnam War. I guess Michael was claiming he was some type of military security during Vietnam, and I've heard him made other claims about Vietnam, and I don't believe any of those are true. But so they got in this car and they're getting ready to take off, and Michael was in the front with Fred, Uncle Fred, God knows, driving them, wearing this. Somebody outside passed by and this big dog went crazy, running back and forth and barking. And, that was kind of the extent of the story. And I asked, what his impression of Fred Krisman Jr., what his impression of Michael was. And he said, well, I wasn't impressed by him. He's more impressed by this huge dog. But the other thing, he said that to him, his impression that Michael was like a lost soul. Take that for what it's worth. It's just another observation of Michael Riconosciuto during that period.
Yeah,
I'm going off on some tangents here, but
thank you. Yeah, we look forward to your forthcoming work. Among other things that Adam's gonna have coming out is those hearings that Michael Riconosciuto, that, as Adam, I tend to agree, suggested he thought that he was trying to broker some type of deal by testifying to these different congressional Judiciary Committee hearings. The Seattle Times, that Adam quotes, wrote that they had sources that they identified as reliable that said Michael told these judiciary committees that there was a flying saucer buried in the Tacoma woods, and that he had been in contact with aliens. So yeah, along with Promise and CIA and everything else, it sounds like he was just throwing everything on the wall to see if anything would stick.
yeah, there was a loop there, it appears, because I've read different things. Michael claimed that he knew who the aviary was, the members of the aviary, which was a hot UFO topic back then, but I think it was this, he had heard about it. Of course, he knew who they were, and he made claims about MJ-12 and a few other things, but it kind of points to the different people he was talking to back then. And part of the conspiracy culture then, Wackenhut also entered the conversation at UFO conference, and there was security at Area 51. So there seemed to be a influence there that Riconosciuto had on the scene at that time, and different researchers of these people like Ted Gunderson and Bo Greitz would go to him with information. He'd say, oh yeah, I know about that, and feed them back information, most of which, all of which, is this
Right.
make believe, probably.
Well, thank you. Before Alison continues, does anyone else have any comments or thoughts on anything? I mean, it's vast.
I have a question.
Sharon.
Oh, Sharon.
Go ahead, Sharon.
I just want to say that is an impressive delivery of that information.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Adam.
Because it's needless to say, it's confusing and a lot of bizarre details. And so I just wanted to say I appreciate the time that went into compiling all that information.
Thanks. And yeah, I heard you guys talking, getting into the nuts and bolts about the Promise software earlier. And it gets confusing to figure out exactly what was what. But my only understanding is that software at the time was very basic. They used the COBOL programming language, which is like really archaic, and it was before the internet. And how would you actually access if you'd created backdoor without the internet at that time? So and then I hear all these other stories about how the what's his name, Robert Maxwell is involved, and the it goes on, and it's just hard to know where some of the where
Indeed.
the real where real information, how much of it is misinformation, disinformation. I'm sure there's some, once again, kernels of truth in there, but God, it'd take a lot of work to figure all this
Yeah.
stuff out. Anyway.
And what was the question?
Oh, the question was, so his first drug bust, the whole point of it being like underwater was that it was undetectable by the police, but obviously it didn't work. He got busted. So
Yeah.
do we know how that happened? Was like an informer, somebody ratted him out, or was he caught again selling drugs somewhere? Or
Well, they were dealing a whole lot of drugs. And I mean, these were huge quantities of LSD over many years. And yeah, there were informers, different people in the conspiracy flipped on him, so they,
that's how it always is. You can build the most secret laboratory in the world, but what gets you is that buddy or guy you hired that rats you out when he gets caught.
Yeah, and one of them was his father-in-law was part of this criminal conspiracy, and there's a half a dozen other people. You just yeah, I don't
It's
I don't know
hard to
that.
move. It's hard to move a lot of product that you don't want anyone to know you sell.
I mean that sounds like some James Bond caper that basically it was a houseboat they had with this trap door underneath, and
Oh my gosh.
is that if you want to keep it on the download from authorities, yeah, I don't know if that's the best way, but
How about you, Rachel? Anything to add?
No, not really. I just wanted to thank you, Adam, for sharing the appendix to your new book with us. I found it really interesting. I also really enjoy your writing. It's really well researched, but I also like your voice and style. It's very funny. I like that you conventionally use the phrase cattle mute. Just
thanks, Rachel.
Mhm.
I appreciate
I
that.
had something else that,
Please.
I mean, for any viewers that watch this, I don't know if Allison mentioned it from the outset, but the reason that or how Danny Casolaro came across the software case information was that he had started out as a technology reporter, and that's how he stumbled upon it.
Yeah, and that has to do with how he initially got on the FBI's radar. That may not be entirely inconsequential that they went and talked to him, and asked him what his newsletter was about. Go ahead, Rachel.
Another thing I was thinking about is that Michael Riconosciuto really reminds me of Bob Lazar. They have a lot of parallels between each other. It's just something to observe.
That's literally what I was just about to say. Great minds think alike, Rachel.
This absolutely, I have trouble articulating it at times, but I think one of the reasons Allison initially told me I should check out this saga is it is such a template for the conspiracy feedback loop. And as one researcher put it, it's like a fictional account of actual events too, that it's got so much misinformation mixed with it. Steve or Erica, anything you'd like to add?
I would just actually like to ask Adam, like, where did Robert Maxwell come in?
I really don't know that much. I've heard somebody was talking about it earlier, had more details than I had, but I've certainly heard more about it recently, and it's one of those things when you start bringing in Robert Maxwell to this story about the octopus, other people are going to jump on that and start connecting it to a lot of other things, and ultimately Epstein. And so be aware of that if you start seeing those connections being made.
Do you
Yeah.
have more on that, Allison, where the Maxwells came in?
No, just what Sarah Kendzior had put in her book. There might be a little bit more about it, but basically what he
Yeah.
was doing was selling selling the software with the back door.
Yeah.
So
And Steve Long, anything?
Yeah, no, thank you for Adam and for Allison. Really enjoying this. I know I'd be willing to bet that he came into this after Epstein's story broke, right? That his name came associated with this after that. It just seems to be the pattern with all this stuff, right? Like Riconosciuto was always talking about stuff that was kind of like big at the moment in the conspiracy thing, right? Like it's not like he
Yep.
talked about working for Wackenhut before Area 51 became a big thing and everybody knew who Wackenhut was, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's how it kind of works with Michael Riconosciuto. And be advised, he's still around, and I know he's talking to other researchers. And so, if you start hearing more of these stories and these connections to Epstein, he might be one of the sources promoting that. That's kind of my suspicion. I
Absolutely.
tried to contact Michael Riconosciuto when I was working on this book, and he has a gatekeeper. Interestingly enough, one of them is Anita Langley, who you'll see in the Octopus Murders documentary. She's his niece. And when I first saw the name Anita Langley, and I go, oh, she was back in the late 90s. She helped, she's part of this, one of the early podcasts called Black Ops Radio that dealt with the Kennedy assassination. And she was with that show till around 2000 or so. And at that time, she launched michaelriconosciuto.com. She left the podcast and devoted a lot of her time to getting the information out that Michael Riconosciuto wanted to get out into the world. One of those was, this was after 9/11. So one of the stories that he was pushing was that, I think it was some deal where Riconosciuto dealt with Osama bin Laden through the CIA, and Osama bin Laden's name was Tim Osman. It's one of these Riconosciuto stories, and that somehow the Promise software was used during the 9/11 attack, and it, like you were pointing out, Steve, that's how it kind of works with Riconosciuto. It seems like who is whatever popular conspiracy theories or names are going on at that time, he weaves them into his overall narrative of the octopus.
Yeah, which is really wild because so much of his stuff checks out that, like, okay, this did happen at a Native American reservation. These people were involved, these people were killed. And then he says, oh, yeah, and I knew bin Laden and he was using Promise.
Yeah, there you go.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so that's one of the crazy things about this whole Promise story is that the capabilities attributed to the software are just quite frankly ridiculous. Like, one, the idea they were using Promise, this old piece of COBOL mainframe software for 9/11, is absurd on its face. In fact, one of the problems with 9/11 was, and this led to another big fiasco and scandal, the FBI's purchase of the virtual case file system, which later became Sentinel, which they blew $1 billion on trying to build a case file system. Because at 9/11, they did not have software that could correlate data sets and find missing connections. That was one of the biggest intelligence failures, and that's what led to the FBI creating the VCF program in the first place, is because such software, quite frankly, did not exist. And it wouldn't even really exist until the last decade or so with companies like Palantir, with the development of machine language and AI algorithms. And so, like, all this crazy, like, conspiracy theories of what they think the Promise software could do is just so patently absurd, like, on its face.
Yeah.
One
Be
of the
worried.
things. Go ahead.
I was
I'm
going to
sorry.
say you should be more worried about Palantir than Promise.
Yeah, one of the things we had discussed was that Promise is kind of framed like as if it was in the evolution of what they're saying about Palantir now. And the way Jeff puts that, I'll just throw this speculation out there. Maybe part of a disinformation campaign was to misrepresent how advanced American and U.S. intelligence community software was at that point in time. Because just as Jeff was saying that, it reminded me a little of Martin Orne and his hypnosis work in MK Ultra. And one of his now declassified messages was that the hypnosis technique was to lead the subject to believe you had a hypnosis technique. And so that's just kind of interesting that maybe that was the disinformation, to have all these people fighting over software that was misrepresented in its capabilities. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah, another thing I was thinking was maybe that there was another form of Promise that basically, another form of software that Promise was, a red herring for, basically, because there's a lot of different, from that period of time, as people kept pointing out in the references I looked at, there's a lot of different software programs called Promise used across a lot of different government agencies, including in the CIA and also, in the private sector. So it's kind of interesting that he chose that name, and I wonder if he did that deliberately because he knew there were so many different Promise systems.
Yeah, that is an interesting point.
So the next person to discuss in the Octopus saga is Dr. John Philip Nichols. He was often called Dr. John or Doc. He was a non-Native American who became the principal financial business advisor and administrator for the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians in California, beginning in 1978. The Cabazon Reservation was very small, economically disadvantaged reservation near Indio in Riverside, California, or Riverside County, California. He subsequently helped develop ventures including a poker club, bingo hall, tax-free cigarette and liquor sales, and eventually gaming. He played a role in the tribe's legal fight over Indian gaming rights. I should note that Casolaro believed Nichols was one of the heads of the 8 tentacles of the octopus. It's difficult to reconstruct Nichols' pre-Cabazon career from conventional biographical records. Accounts associated with his son and later reporting describe him as having worked as a labor organizer, community organizer, and social mental health worker with extensive activity in the United States and Latin America. He reportedly worked with unions, voter registration, and community development projects. He claims he worked for the CIA and had strong ties to others in the intelligence community. He claims that he participated in CIA activities involving Fidel Castro and Chilean President Salvador Allende. He also claims he was part of a covert U.S. weapons operation, that he participated in an Iran-Contra weapons pipeline, and he participated in the promise manipulation. And then you have to talk about the Wackenhut connection now, because this is tied in with him. Wackenhut, for those that don't know, was a very large and extremely important American private security company founded in 1954 by George Wackenhut, a former FBI special agent, and expanded from private investigative work into physical security. The company became particularly successful by taking on contracts that traditionally had been performed by government personnel. It became deeply embedded in the U.S. national security infrastructure. It provided security at nuclear facilities, weapons facilities, government installations, NASA facilities, military installations, embassies, airports, federal buildings, and prisons and detention facilities. One historical account describes the operation as essentially a paramilitary security force. There's lots of question about whether Wackenhut itself was a CIA front. I don't know the answer to that, but it employed or associated with numerous former government officials, military officers, FBI personnel, and intelligence professionals, including Bill Casey, who later went on to become Reagan's CIA director. Something to consider is that Wackenhut could provide the CIA with something extremely useful, a private corporate infrastructure that could conduct sensitive activities without the obvious governmental footprint of an official CIA operation. Then we'll talk about Wackenhut and Cabazon. So Wackenhut and the Cabazon tribe established a business relationship intended to pursue government security contracts. This is confirmed by the DOJ's 1993 investigation into the INSLAW allegations. Nichols wanted the Cabazon Wackenhut operation to pursue military technology and weapons-related business. The DOJ report found documents in Wackenhut's files showing that Nichols was attempting to market night vision goggles and rifle scopes to representatives of Guatemala and Honduras. Nichols apparently believed the Cabazon's foreign status meant ordinary U.S. import-export restrictions did not necessarily apply. Then we must talk about Fred Alvarez and his murder. Fred Alvarez was a Cabazon tribal member who grew suspicious of Nichols and some of the activities taking place on the reservation. He was murdered in 1981 along with his two friends. Later investigations into the Alvarez case produced allegations that Nichols had been involved in a conspiracy surrounding the killing. Decades later, another participant, Jimmy Hughes, was arrested in connection with the case. There's another rabbit hole here, as Jimmy Hughes was let go after he was arrested. He claims to have connections to the intelligence community and claims to have worked as a hitman for them. The complaint against Hughes alleged that he had conspired with John Philip Nichols to prevent Alvarez from exposing illegal activities at the reservation. But Nichols died in 2001, and investigators had not been able to establish his involvement in the 1981 killings before his death. Nichols did spend some time in prison, though. In 1985, Nichols pleaded no contest to 2 felony counts for soliciting the murder of 2 people. The intended killings didn't occur, luckily. He has served approximately 18 months or to 2 years in prison. In summary, the ordinary version of Nichols' biography is already strange enough without the conspiracy theories. He did appear almost out of nowhere, acquire enormous influence over a tiny Native American tribe, establish a joint venture with one of America's most politically connected private security companies, pursue military technology, associate with people involved in intelligence and Central American operations, and eventually went to prison for a separate murder for hire scheme. So I guess I would ask what your thoughts are about John Philip Nichols, and at some point maybe Adam can share how Michael Riconosciuto got introduced to John Philip Nichols.
So, during this period when let's see, during this Cabazon Wackenhut joint venture, this was in the 80s, where Marshall Riconosciuto and Patrick Moriarty had different operations. Kind of in that area was the kitty litter mine they had, of all things, in Maricopa County. A lot of people kind of scratched their heads about that, but a lot of the same nitrogen type materials and kitty litter, you find in explosives, which they had the Moriarty, who really oversaw these operations, had Red Devil fireworks going on. Once again, that might have been a cover for some of Michael's drug operations. We don't know for sure. That's my suspicion. But according to this book, I was looking for the name of it. I have a copy of it. It's called, hold on a second here. The author is Ambrose I. Lane, and it's called The Return of the Buffalo, the story behind America's Indian gaming explosion, which is a pretty interesting read. I mean, it tells the history of the Cabazon Reservation. And when Doc Nichols came into it, I guess this was like in the late 70s, he really got them involved in a lot of different things. First, they were selling basically tax-free tobacco from the reservation. I believe they were the first reservation to do that in California, and they had a bunch of legal challenges. So from that aspect, it's kind of an interesting history of the early days of reservations getting into not only selling tax-free tobacco, but also gaming, and which is now a huge big business in California. But this Cabazon Reservation was really the first to do that, and Doc Nichols spearheaded a lot of that, and there was a lot of lawsuits back and forth with the California government during that period. So yeah, he was always looking to branch out, and one was this joint venture with Wackenhut to get government contracts to develop weapons and other stuff. And I believe that joint venture only lasted 2 or 3 years. It fizzled out. And according to this passage in the book here, an associate of Michael Riconosciuto, basically, or associate of Marshall Riconosciuto, contacted Doc Nichols because they heard that he not only, was the administrator for Cabazon Indian Reservation, but that he was some type of psychotherapeutic wizard, or at least he claimed to. He didn't have any, as far as I know, any actual credentials for doing that, but he treated different patients, and that's where Michael Riconosciuto, I guess, first came in contact with Doc Nichols, because he was having issues, psychiatric issues, and so that's when they first got him, and Doc Nichols was treating him as a psychiatric patient. But, he also had this reputation of this kind of mad genius type. So they were trying to get him rehabilitated or at least into a position where they could bring him in as a kind of research director or an advisor for this joint venture. And so that's where he first entered the picture, with this Wackenhut Cabazon joint venture, supposedly, according to this book. Now, how much he was actually involved in all of this. I mean, Michael's one of those guys who can sit down with a group and start pulling all sorts of information out of the air and sound like the smartest guy in the universe. And so he no doubt impressed certain different people with his ability to talk a good game and his basic knowledge about different weapons systems and electronics and on and on and on. And so, also that was the time where parallel to all this, it started that group with Robert Booth Nichols called Meridian Arms. They were also trying to develop different exotic weaponry, I guess you could call it, to sell to the government. So that's a little background on all of that. I guess the question is how far did they go with any of this? How deeply was Riconosciuto involved in, including the backdoor to the promised software? And I'm dubious that they really did much of anything. And a lot of Michael's energy was going into clandestine drug labs.
Well, I was kind of wondering if they didn't begin use and maybe this is just total speculation on my part, but if they were using the casino to launder money for black ops, but that would just have to assume that he was doing something with the CIA, which I don't know. And I also wonder if Michael Riconosciuto was produced, if they were selling the drugs and using that for black ops. But again, that assumes that they were actually legit connected with what CIA was doing. So
right. Like my interpretation from various sources, including the documentary, is that their involvement at the casino in California included taking the money that they weren't paying the Native Americans. And when people complained about that and objected to how they were handling the money, some people were killed that were involved in the resistance. So it was presumed they were killed because of their resistance, which I don't have any idea, if that's correct or not, but that was implied. And so then the implication is that if they were involved with the intelligence community, then it might tie into drug trafficking and arms trafficking and all of that. But irregardless, it appears we do have a circumstance where someone was questioning the allocation of funds at a casino, and thus there are murders attached to those questions.
Yeah, and I believe one of the individuals that was killed, I think his last name was Alvarez, and he was a tribal member. And he was on, I guess, the whatever they call it, the board of directors or tribal council at one time or another. And his interest was bringing marijuana and being able to sell it if it got legalized in California, finding a way of doing that. And of course, he had other gripes about what was going on if they weren't sharing money with the other tribal members. And so he basically had a falling out with the group, and he was murdered. And supposedly Doc Nichols was part of involved in that murder at some level. And of course, as you're saying, once we get into a murder with the octopus and all the other supposedly things going on out there, was this like a cover up of the Promise Software scandal? It just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, and then as has been pointed out, Doc Nichols went to prison associated with another murder for hire. So there's a lot of implication there. Yet at the end of the day, that's an implication.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, a significant percentage of people on these octopus tentacles went to prison for one thing or another.
And there was a lot of dead bodies surrounding Michael Riconosciuto. I'm not saying he was necessarily responsible, but it was this circle. There was the one in San Francisco they talked about, who was some type of business partner of his.
Paul Moreno is his name.
David Morasca.
Sorry.
Was the one I believe was the one in San Francisco, but yeah, it was
Paul Morasca.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we, how much of this was really about some of these unsavory characters involved in the drug business, and they were part of Michael Riconosciuto's orbit.
Oh, absolutely. So you can imagine, you're a writer, maybe you drink a little too much, whatever, but you're into this really good story. You get these calls from people late at night. You're meeting them in funky places. It's kind of a rush. You like what you're doing. You're onto this story. You do know you're in over your head if it's true. And then some guy at a bar approaches you. You want to tell us about him, please, Alison?
Yes. So Joel Cuellar, he was an Army Reserve major and intelligence connected acquaintance of Casolaro. They happened to meet at a DC bar. Allegedly, Cuellar initiated the conversation with Casolaro and identified himself as military intelligence. According to Casolaro's acquaintances, Cuellar appeared to know an unusual amount about military intelligence, special operations, Casolaro's investigation, and the people that Casolaro had been investigating. Cuellar then offered to arrange access to a former Justice Department promise contracting officer. This was shortly before Casolaro went to Martinsburg, West Virginia. And of course, in the documentary, they're careful not to, say so, but obviously Cuellar is like a person of interest, or some people think that he had something to do with Danny's death. But I think it's highly that wasn't just a coincidence if Cuellar went up to Danny and started talking. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd have gotten off the elevator at that point when a guy in a bar has a lead for me. Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah, that's definitely an odd part of the whole octopus story. It's like, I remember in the documentary, they were able to get a hold of his son. If you guys remember that part, and his son kind of confirmed, yeah, he was a counterintelligence dude and
Yeah.
etc. But it's one of those things like, okay, that's pretty damn strange. Does that
Yeah.
mean the octopus really does exist? Or was he just some guy he met in a bar? Happened,
Or
It's,
for completely different reasons.
yeah.
well, and it makes you wonder, especially if there's a feedback loop going on with different people who are tangentially with intelligence. Like, were they messing with Casolaro? Like, I don't know. Was it some sort of psyop?
Yeah, that I had to make the Benowitz reference earlier, that introducing him to Riconosciuto was, like dosing him with acid without his knowledge.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, who knows what type of investigation might have been going on? Any number of these characters, like Robert Booth Nichols, maybe could have been a separate investigation about him, and they knew he was talking to Casolaro, or who knows exactly.
Yeah, you want to go on to Robert Booth?
Sure. So Robert Booth, he's another interesting one. I'll try to.
Yeah, I find him to be one of the more interesting.
Yes. He was a shadowy businessman / source whom Hamilton introduced to Casolaro. He became important because Casolaro relied heavily on his accounts of intelligence, crime, and overseas dealings. Robert Booth Nichols was not related to John Philip Nichols. We just got to clarify that. Yet the two men became connected through the Cabazon operation. Nichols described himself as a businessman and at various times as someone who had worked for U.S. intelligence. In a lawsuit he filed against the city of L.A., he claimed that he worked for the CIA for approximately 2 decades. When asked for confirmation, the CIA gave the usual Glomar response. For those of you that may not know that are watching this, the Glomar response is basically, I can neither confirm nor deny that. So the FBI, meanwhile, investigated Robert Booth Nichols for alleged organized crime and money laundering connections. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals confirmed that the FBI began investigating Nichols in 1987, and the investigation concerned suspected organized crime activity and potential contacts in Japan and Australia. The documentary suggests that Nichols worked as the link between the intelligence community and organized crime. Nichols and the Cabazon operation, we can talk about that. The House Judiciary Committee obtained evidence that Robert Booth Nichols himself said that he worked with Michael Riconosciuto at Cabazon. According to the committee's report, Nichols told investigators in December of 1991 that he had been hired by John Philip Nichols and he worked with Riconosciuto on the joint venture. Nichols testified in his 1993 lawsuit that he had been involved in a multi-million-dollar effort involving the manufacture of machine guns for foreign governments. Nichols, and let's talk about the relationship between Nichols and Danny Casolaro. Nichols had repeated conversations with investigative journalist Danny Casolaro, and Nichols told House investigators that he had spoken with Casolaro frequently and had acted as a sounding board for his investigation. He declined to provide a sworn statement, however. FBI records later documented an interview with Nichols in which he acknowledged multiple contacts with Casolaro and described their meeting in the Washington area. Nichols also told investigators that he had warned Casolaro about dealing with Riconosciuto and his associates. Interestingly enough, Robert Booth Nichols died, allegedly, in Geneva, Switzerland in 2009. However, you can't find any obituary or anything like that. But the FBI, even though we didn't have an obituary, accepted Jack's FOIA request for more information, and you're still waiting for that response, aren't you?
We are waiting for a final response. They did accept it as properly submitted and sent it for processing. And the only proof of death I had was just magazine articles about the conspiracy, and that he allegedly died in Switzerland. And it's all allegedly because there's no report on it. There's just, you know, a magazine article here and there. And he's known, along with his associates, as being an unreliable narrator. So he's been accused of going to Switzerland and faking his death because of the line of work he was in and all of the controversy surrounding him. But FBI has agreed to go ahead and process it. It'll be interesting to see what we get from that.
Yes. I want to mention one more thing about Paul Morasca, and then the last part we have is the documentary briefly showed on the screen 8 people that Casolaro thought were the tentacles, and I have those. So first of all, Paul Morasca, Adam, you had mentioned that he was murdered, and he was supposedly a financial connection to John Philip Nichols and Riconosciuto. He was found murdered, but the other interesting thing is he was allegedly murdered by Philip Arthur Thompson. Thompson was a suspect, but was never formally charged because there wasn't enough evidence. Fun fact, he was an FBI informant and turned out to be a serial killer. So that's what happened with Philip Arthur Thompson. So next, unless anyone has any comments, I just had to throw that in there to see why it has to be Octopus Murders, because it incorporates so many things. Does anyone have anything, or we'll move on to the 8? Okay. Casolaro's 8 tentacles was his alleged roster, not a proven organization or a finding by a court or government investigation. Several had genuine senior intelligence or government careers. He claimed that George H.W. Bush, we all know he was former president, former vice president, president, and former head of the CIA. E. Howard Hunt was a CIA officer involved in the 1954 Guatemala coup, the Bay of Pigs, and then worked in the Nixon White House. He was notorious for helping plan the Watergate break-in. In Casolaro's account, Hunt represented the overlap between covert operations, anti-Castro networks, and political scandal. Ray Klein was a senior CIA intelligence analyst and served as deputy director for intelligence during the Kennedy administration, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. Casolaro appears to have included him because of his high-level intelligence and policy career. Then we have Richard Helms. He was a career intelligence officer who rose from the wartime OSS into the CIA and served as director from 66 to 73. And then he was the ambassador to Iran.
Perhaps most infamously, the man that got the MK Ultra files destroyed.
Yes, yes. All right. Then there is Ted Shackley. He was a long-serving CIA operations officer. station chief at Miami during anti-Castro operations. And he was a senior official in Laos and Saigon during the Vietnam War. And then associate deputy director for clandestine operations. So he was, you know, that's why Casolaro thought he could be one of the tentacles, heads of the tentacles. Then we have Thomas Clines. Can't find a picture for him. He was a career CIA officer who worked with Shackley and other agency colleagues before leaving in '78. He later took part in the private Iran-Contra enterprise. He was convicted of tax-related felonies for concealing income from operations with the Contra supply operations, and he served prison time. Casolaro likely saw Clines as a bridge between former CIA networks and Iran-Contra. John Philip Nichols, we already talked about him. And then the last tentacle is George Pender. Pender was president and CEO of the first Intercontinental Development Company, a private company, development company. Some octopus-related writers alleged FIDCO functioned as a CIA-connected front and tied it to Cabazon Arms and Lebanon reconstruction projects. It's unknown whether Pender himself held a CIA or U.S. government position. Casolaro most likely included him because of his ties to government contracting. Who was Danny Casolaro, and what about his death? His death was ruled a suicide after multiple investigations. He slit his wrists on both sides and bled out. His body was embalmed before the family was notified of his death. His briefcase was allegedly missing from the hotel room and never recovered. His autopsy showed he was suffering from MS, but we don't know if he had been diagnosed. He seemed to be struggling financially and was really entangled in this web. He also seemed to drink a lot and was becoming unstable. And this might, I don't know what I think. I'm on the fence about his death, because if you look deeply into one, you're like, yeah, it's a suicide. If you watch the documentary, you're like, it might not have been a suicide. But I do wonder if he was murdered, if it was a coincidence that he died when George H.W. Bush was president, since he names Bush as one of the heads of the tentacles. And the facts are crazy, even if you don't believe the entire octopus theory. There are multiple independently documented facts. A tiny Native American reservation became the site of an unusually ambitious security military business operation. Wackenhut really established a joint venture with Cabazon. Michael Riconosciuto worked there. Robert Booth Nichols really became associated with the operation. Military equipment really was demonstrated in the area. Nicaraguan figures were reportedly present at the 1981 demonstration where they showed off some of the weapons they had. Riconosciuto really made sworn allegations about promise, although, side note, I don't know how much value those sworn allegations have, but he did make them. The House Judiciary Committee took those allegations sufficiently serious to investigate them. The Justice Department's handling of the underlying INSLAW contract itself was found deeply problematic by courts and the House Committee. Robert Booth Nichols really was investigated by the FBI for suspected organized crime connections. And Nichols really did have repeated contact with Casolaro. And Casolaro really did encounter a man identifying himself as Joe Cuellar shortly before his death. So those are facts. And those are crazy enough without the other things woven in.
Yeah, I'll reiterate again that it's a crazy enough story that it doesn't its significance doesn't hinge on Casolaro's cause of death or the British journalist in Chile, or how deluded Casolaro may have been by Riconosciuto. There's still a lot of moving parts here that are quite interesting from several perspectives.
Yeah, I think that like it's interesting because I feel like Danny Casolaro came up with this theory that isn't really true, but it's very much like the truth. And I think it was Adam writing in the appendix as Appendix 4. I'm not sure, but I remember reading someone saying like, all the scenery is right, but the details are wrong. Yeah. Another thing, there's the podcast, the Ghost Stories for the End of the World podcast that Bradley had linked to. And in that podcast, I don't know the source for this information, but apparently witnesses close to Danny were saying that his arm was actually too weak to do things like open windows or play tennis and stuff like that. Which, if that's true, that would mean that he could not physically have been able to slit his wrists.
Yeah, Bradley recommended his friend's extensive podcast at Ghost Stories for the End of the World, and I will include that link in the video description as well.
Yeah, I mean, he had an atypical amount of slash marks on his arms, a bit more than you typically get, it's odd, but again, it's also not unheard of, so it's not impossible. I think the Netflix documentary kind of glossed over his personal situation a bit. They pointed out he was in serious debt, but just kind of briefly. And so you had this guy that had apparently severe alcohol problems. He was in severe debt, looks like he was losing his home and everything else. And so that, despite those irregularities, I'm not all that convinced. You always get the family members saying they would never commit suicide. And when you kind of look into it, that doesn't usually turn out to be true. There was significant issues going on that kind of would lead to suicide.
The embalming was weird.
Yeah, I noticed
that aren't you only supposed to embalm a body on the request of the relatives, the loved ones?
Yes.
I mean, that seems really bizarre that they would just go ahead and embalm his body like that. I mean, if at the very least, it's just like an awful thing to do.
Right.
I recently accidentally gouged myself in the arm with a box cutter. And it was very small. It's small. But it made me think about to cut oneself to the extent that he did as a way to commit suicide is really unlikely. That doing that is so painful, and to do it over and over again.
Right. And that deep.
When you could shoot yourself or take pills, that I thought, oh my God, someone who was stabbed, or this is awful, and my gouge is the size of a box cutter. But
Was it just alcohol in his system? Was it just a lot of alcohol, or did they find any other substances in his system?
No, I think there were traces of Vicodin, but I think his alcohol, they found it was 0.4, but I don't know if that was because it was taken directly from the liver or whatever. But yeah, they did find alcohol in his system.
Steve, did you have something?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a good point to make. Although, like Jeff said, the injuries that he had, although a little excessive, aren't totally unheard of, right? People have done that to themselves before, especially if he was in a state of intoxication. But yeah, it's a lot of things on both sides. Although I do think Jeff had a good point that this was certainly a guy that was going through things. He was having money problems. Apparently, he had MS that was apparently starting to cripple him. He has a history of family suicide in his family. His sister had committed suicide. So yeah, it seems like there's a lot of good reason to think that he did commit suicide, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that he could have, right?
How,
That's
go
where I'm
ahead.
at, I guess.
How about this? What if he committed suicide and the local police report still contradicted the witnesses and some of his allegations were correct and some were wrong?
I wouldn't even be surprised if
couldn't
that's the
that line
case.
of reasoning work whether he committed suicide or whether he was murdered? And what if he was murdered and it didn't have anything to do with Michael Riconosciuto and Nichols? That's possible too.
That's
Would we
possible.
even have
Absolutely.
would we even have an octopus conspiracy theory had he not died?
Yeah, this was something that I was thinking about. What if Michael Riconosciuto and some other people drove Danny Casolaro to death, in order to promote this conspiracy theory, Like it would be the perfect sort of murder, for a conspiracy theorist or like a PSYOP agent.
What if he realized he had been strung along all this time and he just wasted years of his life on nonsense and is going to lose his home and was just done with it, and that's why he killed himself? The source he went to meet didn't work out. He went to Tacoma to look for a tape. That didn't work out. Maybe he was at the end of his investigation and finally realized it was all bull and, ended his life.
Yeah, and all your credit cards are maxed out and your source was no good. I think that has merit, along with one of the reasons that the FBI agent named in the Judiciary Committee's report, according to the Washington Post, one of the reasons that FBI agent thought that there were troubling aspects of the crime scene was that he knew that Casolaro had a book that had this FBI agent's phone number in it, and the phone number book was not present at the scene, among other things that people that knew Casolaro say wasn't at the scene.
In my opinion, the documentary did a pretty good job interviewing a lot of people that saw the crime scene, a lot of people that knew him, that said absolutely not, that he was in fear for his life, that he, obviously, as we pointed out tonight, and Alison has done such a great job, but all these figures were deeply embedded in some very troubling, things. So to me, I don't know if I would think that the chances of him committing suicide are not as great as him being murdered. But
well, and Erica, on top of that, I forgot to mention that one of his tendons in his wrist was severed, which at some point would have hindered the ability to actually cut his wrists.
right.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up too. I think it's one point in the documentary that I found really compelling. That, would he have been physically capable of cutting his second wrist if the tendon in his first wrist was severed?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering if that's true, because a lot of things were said in that documentary that aren't. So I'm just wondering if that's a true statement.
But wasn't that part of the autopsy report, though?
It would certainly be,
was.
but I don't know. Has anyone seen that and verified that it's in there?
I've verified elsewhere, I think in the U.S. Attorney Special Prosecutor report about Danny's death, that yes, that was in the autopsy, that yes, he
But
did cut his tendon, or
can
his tendon was cut.
Can you confirm that that tendon was cut before other cuts were made, or was that just the last cut that did it? Can they tell the order?
Yeah.
It doesn't, no, it doesn't, no. I mean, this here, I sent this
Still
link to
had to pick
Jack, this
another one.
report, there's a
Yeah,
report
it could've
just
been the
that they
last
did
one.
on his death. No, they didn't
The
say.
Yeah, it certainly could
whether
have just been the last cut. You know, he did the other cuts and he cut his tendon on the last one and wasn't able to cut it after that or whatever. But
whether he did or didn't is completely irrelevant to the octopus.
yeah, thinking about the tendon, now that I think about
Whether
this, although
he
I'm not disagreeing,
it's
if
irrelevant, which is what
yeah,
Craig Unger says about whether how he died, whatever, was irrelevant to the October surprise.
Yeah, I was gonna say that it's a fair point to ask, would there be a story if it weren't for Casolaro's death? Yet the way Unger handles this story is pretty much the same story, but just from a professional journalist point of view. And he's coming at it from the October surprise. I also think Steve asking for that we've got to get the records ourselves and look at them ourselves is a fair point. But I think what Alison's saying is fair too, that if you're looking at a source that says they have it and looked at it, but that's a fair point as well. And yeah, ultimately, it's its own case. Like the Danny Casolaro case really doesn't have anything to do with the significance of Robert Booth Nichols and the Riconosciutos and what they were telling FBI agents and everybody else. It's just the way these documentary makers happened to come at the story was through Casolaro's friends and family.
Yeah, I mean, why don't they make a documentary about Fred Alvarez? That's my question. It seems like a much more interesting case, murder case.
or Booth Nichols.
Yeah, he is interesting. And himself, like what was his career? What did he do? Is he somewhere in the Bahamas, smoking cigars and having margaritas as we speak?
I don't know if those films of him 15 years ago or so look pretty rough. I don't doubt if he's still around. I wanted to point out one thing before we wind up here, and about Robert Booth Nichols. In the Octopus Murders documentary, you have the journalist Sherry Seymour, who was looking into this way back when and wrote the book, and Danny Casolaro and Mike was talking to Michael Riconosciuto, and they hooked her up with Robert Booth Nichols, and she went to meet with him somewhere. I forget where he was living at the time. And it's this big dramatic scene she writes about in the book, and they, do a recreation in that Octopus Murders where she's taken into a dark lit room and Nichols is in the shadows smoking, like the guy from the X-Files or whatever, and he shows her a film. And it's a film of the Kennedy assassination. You guys remember this from the
I do.
Yes,
I do.
please go
Yeah.
on, yes.
And so and the driver turned around and shot Kennedy. My God, I was horrified and was like,
Oh yeah.
this is from John Lear and Bill Cooper. During that period in the late when was it, 80s, early 90s, that they got a hold of that film that they were promoting, that the driver of the Lincoln Town Car, Secret Service agent, killed Kennedy. I recognized that immediately. It's like, what? And
Interesting.
I found out, later that I think through Tanner's work, the connection between John Lear and Robert Booth Nichols. So, I'm sure that's where he got this film, the so-called, of the driver killing Kennedy. It was just something that was floating around. In fact, Lear showed it at the MUFON Symposium in 1989. But it goes into the whole octopus mythos that its tentacles reach everywhere, to the Kennedy assassination, to the October surprise, 9/11, on and on and on.
I
But
got
there's
it.
an important reason why he showed her that. Right? He showed
Plausible
her,
deniability.
right.
Yeah.
Explain it, Jack. Yeah. Or-
Yeah.
Yeah.
That she's not believable now.
Right.
As my contact has that. I got to tell you, Adam, along the lines of hearing something in these stories that goes, oh, I recognize that.
Yeah.
when the night vision goggles and the equipment came up about Nichols and they're down there near San Diego, I thought about Robert Guffey and Camellia, and it was night vision goggles that were the linchpin that set that whole story off. That's another insane story. But
Yeah.
we're down to about 5 minutes, guys. Erica, any closing thoughts?
This has been a fascinating conversation that we could have multiple more times, go down a few more rabbit holes, because that seems to be what we're very good at. But I love the connections with everybody in the UFO community, and it's just makes you really think, about all of that. So really great
Yes.
discussion.
Yes.
And thanks, Allison.
Yes, thank you, Allison. Thank
And
you,
Adam, it's so
Erica,
fun to
for
have you
joining
here.
us.
Yeah. Thanks. It was fun.
Yeah.
Thanks,
and
everybody.
Sharon, any closing thoughts?
I don't think so. Allison, you've done a tremendous job leading.
Thank you. Thanks.
I know you put a lot of time into putting the information together.
Anyone else? Rachel, anyone?
Yeah, thank you, Allison. It's nice to meet you, Adam. It's been really wonderful. Also, the Promise software was sold to Canada, or not Canada. Several provinces in Canada did institute Promise software, but I guess they didn't like it. Like it was not very efficient.
Interesting.
I have a document showing that.
Jeff, last thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, so for me, the whole thing with all this is we know that the INSLAW software case is real. It's a real case, some weird things with it, you can dig into. We know Danny Casolaro died. Maybe he was murdered, maybe it was suicide. The problem for me is the attempt to tie this into like everything under the circus tent conspiracy theory, where every major conspiracy theory from the 80s and 90s is somehow related to each other, and it all connects to INSLAW. That's where it kind of all breaks down for me. I think the INSLAW case, for example, is interesting enough to dig into on its own, like without trying to tie it into the October surprise, the banking problems of the 80s, and every other, and 50 plus murders.
Quick thoughts, Steve?
I agree with Jeff. As so often is the case, real life is far more interesting on its own, but yet there's just a lot of fiction interjected in there for all kinds of reasons, and it's very interesting nonetheless. But thank you. It's been really interesting. And Allison, thanks for putting this together and for including me. And everybody have a great night.
Thank you.
Can
And
I just
thank
close up
you.
and
Oh,
excuse me,
Erica.
really quickly. I just wanted to say that I wanted to, for our listeners and people that have followed Expanding Frontiers, that we lost a really important member of our community. We found out about that. Amy Collins passed away. And so I just, yeah, what my heart goes out to her. We found this out. And so I know that she meant a lot and was so wonderful in our chat and a wonderful part of this community. And I just wanted to just give her my love. I know she's with her cat, Dinah. And so thank you for letting me share that.
Sure, thank you. Yes, Amy will be missed. And thanks, Adam, for being here. Allison, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Sure.
you.
And thank you for listening at home. If you would like to sit in on one of our discussions, reach out to me, email me at jackbrewerblog@yahoo.com for details. Follow us on Blue Sky and follow our EFR Patreon for news and updates, as well as our website. And thank you to all of you for being on the initial episode of the Interactive Research Project. And good night, everyone.
Thank you.